Humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It affirms the dignity of all humans. Humanists believe that this is the only life of which we are certain. And because of that, we attempt to live the best life that we can envision for ourselves. We do this for ourselves, our family, our friends, and for all the other living creatures with whom we share this fragile planet. And this morning, our topic, Creating a Banking System for People, Not Wall Street, by David Delk, especially addresses the humanist commitment of social justice, global awareness, and responsibility. It is HGP's first Sunday tradition to include music.
I found today a chestnut tree that made me smile right down the street from where I'm living now. Though I know you're far away, I've been thinking of the way you spend your day. Autumn's here again, and life's turning round, dying to be reborn with the wind. And when October ends, I'll fly to where you live again and quietly move in. The things that make me sad today are the autumn's past and childhood days that never last, and the tears that fall on my cheeks are the only words my soul knows how to speak. Autumn's here again, and life is turning round, dying to be reborn with the wind. And when October ends, I'll fly to where you live again and quietly move in. Take an hour this afternoon to walk alone with all the lives I might have known, for I can hear the autumn call, more reasons now to watch the chestnuts fall. Autumn's here again, and life is turning round, dying to be reborn with the wind. And when October ends, I'll fly to where you live again and quietly move in. When October ends, I'll fly to where you live again and quietly move in.
I'd like to introduce our speaker now, David Delk. Prior to retiring, he worked for the Housing Authority of Portland. Currently, that he found time to speak to us today, I'm pretty amazed because he's a very busy man. Currently, he is the co-chair of the Portland Alliance for Democracy and the co-chair of the National Alliance for Democracy. He is the chief petitioner for a number of city, county, and state initiative petitions to establish campaign finance limits. He is the founder of the Portland Move to Amend organization with the goal to amend the U.S. Constitution to affirm into law that corporations are not people and money is not speech. David also founded the Portland Public Banking Alliance, which grew to become the Oregon Public Banking Alliance. David is an active member of both the First Unitarian Church and the Y East Unitarian Fellowship. He is treasurer and board member of the Oregon Unitarian Voices for Justice and the state chair of the Oregon Progressive Party. David, thanks for finding the time to speak with us today on this important topic.
Yeah, I really appreciate being asked to come back. She made me sound a lot busier than I actually am. A lot of those things don't take a lot of time. So anyway, I do appreciate being able to come back and speak to you again. I was here, I'm going to guess 4 or 5 years ago, and I spoke then about the need to end the dominance of corporations and to end the concept that money is speech. And I said that we needed to pass a U.S. constitutional amendment to end the U.S. Supreme Court's created doctrines that corporations are people and have human rights, and that money is speech. Both concepts created by several U.S. Supreme Court decisions, including the Citizens United decision most recently. The proposed constitutional amendment I was and still do support is the We the People Amendment, which is HJR 48, which declares that corporations are not people and that money is not speech. I love repeating that over and over and over again. So remember, that gets to the crux of the question about corporate domination. So support for this is still needed, and I now invite you, not right immediately, I invite you to call your U.S. representative to be co-sponsors of HJR 48, which has in the past been co-sponsored by both Representative Blumenauer and Representative Bonamici. We need them back on board in this new session of Congress. The bill will be introduced again with the same number, HJR 48, and we need them back on board as co-sponsors. We also need to get all of those other U.S., Oregon U.S. representatives on board with it as co-sponsors as well. So I invite you to make calls to whoever your U.S. representative is and ask them to support, actually not support, to sponsor HJR 48 in the new Congress. Just a few words about who I am and why I think public banking is an important topic to consider. I do want to let you know that I founded the Oregon Public Banking Alliance to advocate for the creation of a public banking system in Oregon. We originally were striving to get a public bank just for Portland, and then we went and changed our focus to be statewide, in part because in the legislature there is this rural and urban divide, and anytime you say that you want to create something for Portland, everybody else says no. so let's try to do this statewide first and then come back and get the city of Portland and other cities. More information on the Oregon Public Banking Alliance is available at their website, www.oregonpublicbanking.com. That's a good source for learning more about public banking in general. And I am also the national co-chair of the Alliance for Democracy. And we put out these periodicals because we don't have a schedule for when we do them, but we try to get 2 of them out each year. And this particular issue was from spring of 2014, and it is titled Public Banking, Creating Jobs, Building Communities. So I invite you to take one of these with you, and a lot of what I say is in here. I did these real quickly last night. So what I'm going to talk most about is the Oregon Public Banking Alliance the Oregon Public Banking Alliance supported a bill in the Oregon legislature to create a task force to study public banking and creating a state public bank. So this little sheet has a little bit about that and about the public and about that bill, of the bill number, and how you can find your elected political leaders. I will point out also that for many of us, and I was surprised this happened to me, I was always been in Senator Dambro's district very solidly, and they redid the lines, and I'm not there anymore. So I found out that now I've got to build relationships with yet 2 more Oregon representatives and senators. So I got to do that. So anyway, look up to see that you actually have the same person. And the same with Blumenau and Bonamici. Those districts changed as well. So now back to my prepared remarks. So personally, I was born in 1950 in an apartment building at Southwest 14th and Taylor, real close to Lincoln High School. I have a twin brother, and we were born to a single mother, which in 1950 was very unusual. My mother was naturally unemployed because of having 2 children, but the United States had an actual welfare system then, and while the checks came each month, the payments were very low, guaranteeing that the recipients lived in poverty, contrary to what President Reagan would say later about welfare queens. I became very aware that the U.S. was a democracy, is still a democracy, at least in form, but not always, maybe not usually in function, that there was an economic elite that benefited from the system in undue proportion, and that certainly banks and the financial system in general was at the top of the pyramid. I also learned from that great political cartoon, Pogo. Anybody remember Pogo? Yeah, a favorite. So one of the first lessons that I learned in my political development was from Pogo. And he said that he who has the gold or the money makes the rules. And I did not have any gold, and I did not have any money. So during the Vietnam War, much protest centered around banks, especially the Bank of America, for their war profiteering. I also learned about the Great Depression and the role that the financial sector, mostly banks, played in creating the economic devastation. But then much more recently in the Great Recession of 2008, people being thrown out of their homes due to the greed of the too big to fail banks. Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase, Citibank, or Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and a whole bunch more. So I have had no love for these banks, seeing them largely as parasites on the body politic as well as the economic body of the United States. Following the Great Depression, investment banks were separated from commercial banks by the Glass-Steagall Act, legislation by the Roosevelt administration to prevent other occurrences of the Great Depression. Investment banks had, and still do, engaged in risky behavior which produced the Great Depression, as opposed to commercial banks, which made and still make loans, accept deposits, and work with small and medium-sized businesses and consumers, generally locally, and generally avoiding risky investments. Those investment banks work by providing services to large corporations and institutional investors. The merger of these 2 types of banks, commercial and investment, led directly to the Great Depression and the Great Recession of 2008 by spreading the risk of the investment banks to all financial institutions. During the Clinton administration presidency, the Glass-Steagall Act law was overturned. And that was what had kept these banks separate for all those decades from when Roosevelt was instrumental in getting that passed. And the remerger of the 2 types of banks began again. The result, a second, but smaller, luckily, smaller Great Recession in 2008. So following the Great Recession, several reform movements began. One was an effort in Congress, which resulted in the Dodd-Frank Act. But while Dodd-Frank had some good points, it did not include the reinstitution of Glass-Steagall, which would have again separated those risky investment banks from the commercial banks. They are still joined at the hip today. So what did the Dodd-Frank bill do? Well, one change was that the federal government would no longer be involved with bailing out too big to fail banks. The federal government would no longer be involved with bailing out the too big to fail banks. They were just going to let them go. But some other thought came forth, and they decided that there needed to be an alternative to that policy, and they called it the bail-in. The bail-in had been first used in the Cyprus financial crisis of 2012 and 13, and said that the depositors had to take some or maybe most of the responsibility for saving the economy by allowing financial institutions in crisis to grab up to 10% of the depositor's assets right out of your pocket. So that's what the law says now. So no more public money to bail out too big to fail banks, but they're going to take it out of your deposits, especially if you have a deposit of more than $250,000. So anyway, since it had worked there in Cyprus and the crisis ended, the new international norm was established in the European Union, giving banks in distress, in other words, those in danger of collapse, the ability to use capital, debt capital deposits as equity to avoid going under. This includes capital from unsecured creditors, common and preferred shareholders, bondholders, and depositors whose account balance exceeds the FDIC insured limit of $250,000. So in order for this money to come out of your account, you had to have at least $250,000. So there was a little saving for probably most of us, but still. The deposits of American governmental entities could have their assets seized under a bail-in scenario. So governmental entities like state, county, and city government deposit accounts could all be subject to the seizures of the bail-in solution. This puts all governmental agencies at risk of the failures of the investment banks in the future. Another important response to the Great Recession was for individuals to stop banking with the too big to fail banks by transferring their financial accounts to credit unions or community banks. This was partially successful. A lot of accounts did get moved. However, most people had so many automatic deposits and withdrawals going on that they were hesitant to engage in this transfer to new accounts. And so they stayed with the too big to fail banks. Another response has been to drive the creation of public banks, banks which would not take the risk that the too big to fail banks take as a standard mode of operation. Public banks would work with local community banks and credit unions to make loans in the local economy. The American people started acting on the desire to develop alternative financial institutions. This effort led to create a national system of public state banks and local and regional public banks. That effort has grown stronger every year. Just during 2019, 18 bills were introduced into various states in order to create state public banks. And while we generally say that there is only one public bank in the U.S., the Bank of North Dakota, there was recently a new public bank created in America, Samoa, following the withdrawal of the only private bank that had done business there before. So they were left with no banking services at all. So they created a public bank to serve their own needs. The documents creating this new public bank is clear on who should be on their board of directors. They should possess knowledge of the financial services and banking industries, and it also specifies how they should be compensated for their services. The directors should be paid $5,000 annually, with the board chair receiving a salary of $6,000 annually. That should be compared to the annual pay raise, this is just the raise, given to Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, of almost $35 billion. That was 1 year raise in his pay, and that was 10% more than the prior year. Jamie Dimon is head of a bank which has admitted to 5 criminal felony charges brought by the U.S. Department of Justice over the past 7 years for rigging markets and laundering money. Instead of sacking Mr. Dimon, JP Morgan Chase has made Mr. Dimon a billionaire. This information, by the way, comes from blog postings on Wall Street on Parade, a citizen's guide to Wall Street. And these writings that he does, actually they do, I think it's a husband-wife team, can be rather dense, but at the same time they're very, very informative. So it's called the Wall Street on Parade, a citizen's guide to Wall Street. So this blog contains a listing of fines which Jamie Dimon's bank paid to various U.S. governmental regulators. These fines for a 10-year period from April of 2011 to December of 2021 totaled more than $20 billion, and they still kept him on. These fines were paid ultimately by the shareholders of JP Morgan Chase, but instead of firing the CEO, the bank's board of directors made him a billionaire. That is not behavior that a public bank would engage in. While the too big to fail privately owned banks work to increase profits for their shareholders, their CEO, and upper management, a public bank is owned by the people through their representative governments, which could be a city, a county, a state, a tribe, or a federal entity like the post office or a national infrastructure bank, but both of which are proposed in Congress now. A public bank can receive deposits of public funds, taxes, fees, fines, and interest earned from and make loans to governments that establish and own it. By minimizing operational costs and recirculating bank profits back to the people, public banks enhance the financial health of the general public fund. It may also choose to partner with local financial institutions, credit unions, and community banks to expand their loaning capacity in the local economy. A public bank would have a public charter, a democratically constructed statement of public purpose and public mandate outlining its reasons for existing, which would align with the goals of the representative government that created it. For example, to deliver quality, sound financial services to meet the mission of the city to be prosperous, equitable, healthy, and resilient. A public bank is governed by professional, experienced bankers. Employees are salaried public servants paid by the government agency or entity which establishes the public bank with a transparent pay structure. So all of us would know how much each one of those individuals that's doing the work actually gets paid. Those public employees would not earn bonuses, commissions, or fees for generating loans. Those loans are made into the local and state economy, not to projects elsewhere in the nation or the world. The money stays here. A public bank has the ability to make loans at a rate of 10 to 1, just like a private bank does, creating money in the process, thereby increasing the economic benefit derived from the funds invested in its capitalization. It could go to the Federal Reserve and borrow funds at the lowest rates available. It has all of the financial abilities of a private bank while using the profit it makes for the benefit of the public instead of shareholders and CEOs. All the profits of a public bank's activities go back into the treasury of the state or the governmental entity which establishes it, and into the local economy. By being able to borrow funds at the lowest rates from the Federal Reserve's discount window, it can finance, for instance, infrastructure projects at much lower cost than would be incurred if the financing happens via Wall Street bond markets. North Dakota has the only public bank in the United States, and it is over 100 years old. Each year since its founding, the Bank of North Dakota has returned profits back to the state's treasury after repaying the original capitalization cost. Every year, it puts money back into the state. The North Dakota Public Bank partners with North Dakota-based credit unions and community banks to provide benefits to the state, as well as low-cost loans to students and farmers. In an emergency, the bank was able to use those partnerships to speed recovery. For instance, according to the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in an article titled Public Banks, the Bank of North Dakota, they said this on the massive flooding in 1997 which destroyed the cities of Grand Forks in North Dakota and Grand Forks across the river in Minnesota. Quote, Bank of North Dakota quickly established a $25 million line of credit for the city of Grand Forks, $12 million for the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks, and $25 million for state emergency management. It also set up a disaster relief loan program for families and businesses. Partly as a result of this support, the Grand Forks, North Dakota, economy recovered much more quickly than its sister East Grand Forks just across the river in Minnesota. End quote. Private banks are created and serve the interests of private investors. Private banks have no mandate to serve a public interest. They are profit-seeking institutions which invest globally instead of serving the local economy. Unlike private banks, public banks exist to finance projects at the local level. And I keep saying that, and I'm sorry to be redundant, but it's really important. Who are you going to serve? Are you going to serve the people who live here, or some people who are making a lot of profits in New York City or Chicago or in Europe? Unlike private banks, public banks exist to finance projects at the local level at the lowest cost and for a public purpose. Public banks are not retail banks. In other words, they do not have storefronts and street front branches. If you need the services of a street front bank, like checking or a savings account, you are encouraged to go to your local credit union or community bank, which already has a vast network of storefront operations. This network of street front stores is not a cost that public banks need to assume, thereby lowering their operating costs. Public banks can, and in the case of the Bank of North Dakota, act as a banker's bank. What does that mean, a banker's bank? If you were establishing a new business or had a public housing project to finance and build, you would go to your local credit union and or community bank. These financial institutions would do their due diligence, and if the project passed their standards for a loan, but the loan requirement was too large for that local financial institution itself, the financial institution would take the project to the public bank and ask them to partner together on the project. On the basis of the local financial institution's request and the public bank's own examination of the project, a partnership deal could result with the public bank providing financial backing in partnership with the credit union and the community banks. And I was watching Channel 8 last night, and there was a news story about some man who, I think somewhere in Milwaukee or Gladstone, somewhere down there, had built two very square-looking buildings with studio apartments in them. And he wanted to do more of them. They had filled up very fast, and they were getting people off the street. And so he was doing what we all think needs to be done. And so he wanted to build more of these, but he couldn't, because he couldn't find the financing. And that's where a state bank comes in for those local projects that can't get enough money to actually be successful. They can go to the state bank and get their partnership. And so that project for this man in the local economy could be well on its way if we had a state public bank, or a city public bank for that matter. So I'm ad-libbing. But it was just real striking to me that I was going to be standing here and talking about this, and there was the perfect example of what I was talking about, or am talking about. So let's see. In the case of a public project, like a public housing project, the public housing developer could get funding from various governmental agencies, other sources, with a public bank making up any outstanding balance, and the project could move forward. A public bank would be structured with a statement of public purpose, which might be directed at public housing, environmental protections, infrastructure, public transportation, schools, or bridges, or more. If a city, for instance, wanted to say, replace the Burnside Bridge, they could go to the citizens for project approval and then finance the project with the assistance of a state or their own city public bank. By not having to go to Wall Street bond markets, as much as 50% of the project costs can be saved because the public bank can go to the Federal Reserve and borrow money to cover the cost at the lowest rates available. The Federal Reserve could give the public bank access to their lowest interest rates, the same interest rates, incidentally, that they already give to the private banks. While the private banks would issue bonds subject to their inflated interest rates and fees, the public bank could do it much less expensively, charging much lower interest rates, saving the city and taxpayers a lot of money, even as the public bank makes a profit on the transaction. But the beauty of this is that the profit would be returned to the public body that created the public bank, instead of to the private banks, CEOs, and shareholders. So with a public bank, you don't have to deal with the too big to fail Wall Street banks. You will pay less, and you can return a profit to the local economy. A public bank is a publicly created institution which, number one, works with local banks and credit unions to make local projects work. It is created by a public governmental body to finance locally needed projects. It is run by professional and experienced bankers with a board consisting of representatives of local public interest advocates. So it's not just banks sitting on the board. It's also local public interest advocates. As a public bank has a governing body created by the founding documents, which include a statement of public purpose. Public bank is a safe venture operating for the long-term benefit of the public and has salaried public servants paid by the creating body with a transparent pay structure. Those public employees would not earn bonuses, commissions, or fees for generating loans. Generating loans will be left to the credit unions and the community banks. And lastly, a public bank does not have a public retail presence to support. No branches, and therefore less expensive to operate. So where do we go from here in Oregon to create a state public bank? Public banking needs your support by contacting your local public officials at any level of government to express your interest in public banking for the public interest. They need to hear from you. Sarah Anaron ran for Portland mayor a few years ago. I went to a number of her public events and always asked her position for creating a public municipal bank in Portland. She was always very, very supportive, very knowledgeable on the question, and spoke at length on the benefits of public banking. At one point, I asked her why she never brought the topic up herself. She always responded to my question, and she always called on me. So I was kind of like, well, that's one thing. At one point, I asked her why she never brought the topic up herself. Her answer was that people did not seem to be interested in the topic. They would listen, but no one would follow up expressing any support for the idea. Therefore, she never put it forward as being of importance to her, except in response to an audience question. So it is very important that if you support the idea of establishing public banks, that you express that to candidates for any public office and or to individuals who have already been elected to a public office. I got a very similar answer to my question from Senator Golden, who has sponsored a bill in the Oregon legislature now and in the past to create a state public bank, as well as a bill to establish a public banking task force to study the possible benefits or harms that creating a state public bank might entail. He said that he might not go forward with the proposals because no one expresses interest in the idea, clearly showing the need for candidates and elected officials to hear from constituents like you on your feelings of the benefits that might be derived from having a public bank. Nonetheless, he has gone forward with the public banking task force idea. You can contact your state representative and senator, express your desire that they support public banking in this current session of the Oregon legislature. HB 2763, sponsored by Senators Golden, Gamble, who is the former mayor of Milwaukee, Dembro, Fredericks, Jama, and Representatives Hudson, Nelson, Confan, and Walters, would create a task force to study and make recommendations regarding establishment of a state public bank, with the requirements that the task force report of their findings be made by January 31st, 2024, next year, less than a year from now. So this idea could move very quickly. The task force would be composed of 21 members, including members from the Democratic and Republican parties, as well as members from minority parties like the Pacific Green Party or the Oregon Progressive Party, both of who support public banking. Other task force members would be appointed by the governor, including representatives from the management of a credit union, a cannabis business, a community bank, someone with farming experience, someone who is a lawyer or is an expert and is an expert on public banking. I only know one person in Oregon that meets that qualification, and that's a law professor at Willamette University who has been very active with our Oregon Public Banking Alliance group. A representative of county governments, a representative of the Oregon Public Banking Alliance, I might be appointed, and representatives of various unions and other organizations. So this task force would be very broad-based representation of many different interests, both urban and rural, business and labor, major political parties, as well as minor political parties. The task force is called to explore the potential benefits and harms of a state bank engaging in lending, payments, or providing other public infrastructure related to, among others, a depository for community credit unions and community banks, loan markets for, well, I got this long list, I'm not going to go, but also in particular, they talk about needing to explore the value that a state bank might provide for affordable housing construction during economic downturns, for providing student loans, agricultural loans to incentivize sustainable farming practices, a green bank, and other things. So we need your support for this task force to actually come into existence. So call your state senator, state representative, tell them to vote yes for the Public Banking Task Force Bill, number HB 2763. Write a letter to the editor, or maybe contact someone at the local media calling on them to cover this bill. Go to a town hall meeting and do the same. Let's create some buzz. Let's create some buzz. So I will point out again that I did this little sheet because I'm sure that you won't remember what that bill number is. You got it. Okay, great. So yeah, this sheet has the bill number on it, as well as a link for finding your elected officials. Again, I would suggest that you look at this link to see who your actual members of the Oregon legislature are, because they may have changed. So that's basically all I'm going to talk about on public banking, except for responses to your question. But I would like to present some other bills and initiatives that I think that we should support in order to have a progressive Oregon and a progressive nation. And so I think that we need to support strong labor unions. So, and by doing that in the city of Portland, you can support the Portland Jobs with Justice organization, and at the national level, support the PRO Act, which is S420 in the Senate and HR 842 in the House. PRO stands for Protecting the Right to Organize Act. Wyden and Merkley both are listed as co-sponsors in the last session of Congress, as well as Representatives Blumenauer, Bonamici, and DeFazio, who of course has retired now, being listed in the U.S. House. The bill has not yet been reintroduced into the current session of Congress. Now is a great time to make the contact and let our representatives, U.S. representatives, know you support and value strong labor unions and the PRO Act. We need limits on campaign finance contributions and expenditures, especially at the state level, which Oregon still, in spite of our best efforts, still has no state limits on campaign contributions and expenditures. So 2 new initiatives for the November 2024 ballot have been introduced into the Secretary of State's office. We hope to start collecting signatures in the next month. I will be one of the 3 chief petitioners on both of these initiatives, which are IP8 and IP9. One is a Oregon constitutional amendment requiring that if people pass a set of limits on campaign contributions, et cetera, using the initiative process, then any changes to those limits need to be approved by the voters. If this is important, because in the past, I'm going to say 6 years, a couple of states had initiatives passed to limit campaign contributions, and before they even went into effect, the state legislatures declared them void. We don't want that happening in Oregon. So your support on that one will be really crucial. And the other one is a set of limits on money in politics written to be as loophole free as possible. We can't do that. We can't do that. But both of these ballot measures need to be on Oregon's ballot in November of 2024. While the Oregon legislature could enact limits, the Oregon legislature has never done so. Hoping that they will is really engaging in wishful thinking. We need to do this ourselves. So please sign these when asked. And hopefully I will have these petitions in within the month. And if I can, I will come back and grab your signatures if I have your permission. So I think further that we need to support the Oregon People's Rebate Initiative, which would increase the corporate tax on revenues generated from sales over $25 million in the state of Oregon and distribute that increased revenue to each Oregon resident from the prior year, about $750 per resident, man, woman, child, here legally or illegally, it doesn't matter. Everyone who could prove that they lived here for 200 days during the prior year would get this refund. That's $3,500 for a family of four each year. No mom and pop businesses nor any individuals would be paying this increase in tax. The only corporations with sales within Oregon of over $25 million are the largest of the large retail establishments, nationwide establishments. They currently take the profits from their sales out of state, thereby not benefiting Oregonians nor the local economy at all. The Oregon People's Rebate Campaign estimates that the rebate would result in a reduction of 26% in child poverty and a reduction in overall poverty of 15%. Impressive figures. And I'll point out that they have at my request, they did a flyer which explains this. And so you're welcome to come up and grab one of these, or I can hand you one now, which has all the details. And there are a couple of little errors on there, grammatic errors, and they haven't changed them yet. But it doesn't change the substance of what they say. As they say, corporations should pay their fair share of taxes, and that cash is care. A phrase I had not heard before. Cash is care, in that cash directly reduces poverty and provides opportunities. Cash stimulates local, urban, and rural communities where the money is spent. Should the money go out of state or should it stay here? Other political system reforms at the state level, support for ranked choice voting and or the star system of voting, and create a citizens committee to do redistricting instead of the legislature doing it as they do now. And there'll be initiatives for star voting, certainly, probably ranked choice voting, and for the redistricting. At the national level, end the wars. Say no to NATO and nuclear arms. Support the Move the Money campaign in Congress called the People Over the Pentagon's Act. It's an effort to move $100 billion from the Pentagon budget to budgets serving human needs, like the recently expired food stamp program, now known as SNAP, a benefit which Congress failed to reauthorize while it was approving the largest military budget in history of over $858 million just for the coming year. By the end of this decade, the military budget is expected to exceed $1 trillion every year. $1 trillion every year. This bill, the People Over the Pentagon Act, has in the past been co-sponsored by Earl Blumenauer and Peter DeFazio, now retired. When it is reintroduced, it should be co-sponsored by all Oregon U.S. representatives. Senator Merkley and Wyden should introduce it into the U.S. Senate. Call them to support and co-sponsor the People Over the Pentagon Act of 2022, or probably will now be titled 2023. And I have a postcard, love postcards, this yellow one, and it is, of course, it's talking about the bill from last year, but it asks again and gives some details about the People Over Pentagon Act of 2022, and has a link for finding your member of Congress there as well. So please feel free to grab one of those also. So other things that we should be supporting, we should be providing active support for no cuts to Medicare or Social Security. And we can do that by supporting the bill by Senator Sanders and Warren, and as her first introduction into the U.S. House of Representatives, Representative Val Hoyle is also a chief original co-sponsor of the bill. So yay. So support, and the bill is titled the Social Security Expansion Act. Enact Medicare for all. Support and enact the billionaire tax, wealth tax, known as the Ultra Millionaires Tax Act of 2021, which Senator Wyden supported, Senator Merkley supported, and in the House, it is HR 1459, and was supported by Representative DeFazio, who of course is no longer there. Okay. And lastly, where I started with this whole conversation, support that constitutional amendment that says that corporations are not people and money is not speech. HJR 48. Several of our representatives already supported. They all need to be encouraged to continue to support it, and those who have not need to be encouraged to get signed on. I have a few more notes, but I'm getting signals that say, okay.
Well, we're getting it.
So I will end with that. Let me repeat the point of my talk was to support efforts to create a state public bank, call candidates for public office, call those who are already elected with statements of support for public banking, for creating a public banking task force in Oregon with support for HB 2763. This would be a first and very important step to actually creating a state bank in Oregon. So thank you for letting me bend your ear. And so now I think I'm open for questions.
Yeah. Well, here's our first question, though. This comes from the Zoom audience, Paul Haggard. What investments are the primary ones by the North Dakota Bank? Do you know the primary investments?
Well, the Bank of North Dakota was founded for the purpose of providing assistance to the agricultural section of the economy in North Dakota when the East banks were cutting them off, and they weren't financing those local projects like granaries that were needed by the agricultural center. So that portion continues to be a major part of what they do. They also provide student loans at lower rates than you would normally get from whoever does student loans. And so that in fact, they have even broadened to allow students from other states to access those loan possibilities. So that is a major one also.
We have a question from Hank Rabb. What's the compensation for the North Dakota bank directors? And how is it that more such banks as these public banks were not created in the 1930s?
Well, more of those banks were created in the 1930s. However, for reasons that I don't know, they just did not continue to exist, and they were I would guess that they met such opposition from what we now refer to as too big to fail banks that they just couldn't continue. The other part of it is that the Bank of North Dakota really went out of their way to address problems that real people had in the state of North Dakota. And so I think that, they had so much support that they were able to withstand the opposition from the too big to fail banks. In terms of the salaries, I should have anticipated that, but I didn't. I don't know the answer to that. But I know that it is not $35 million like Jamie Dimon got just as a raise in 1 year.
Okay. We have a question from Friendly House. Al Christians, come on in.
Yes, I've got a lot of experience with financial institutions, mostly insurance companies, but all kinds of things in finance. And the one thing that I see is that, and you mentioned the crash, the great crash on the failures and all that. The one thing that I see associated them with those things is when a financial institution can seize an opportunity to accelerate its income by acting as a middleman. That then, by encouraging the creation of paper assets, because you get all your income up front and somebody else winds up holding the asset, you ultimately have a crash.
Mm-hmm.
And the system you have described of credit union or community bank making loans and somehow passing them along to the state bank puts them in that, gives them that temptation if this relationship is not set up properly. So I'm worried about, is the state bank going to pay fees to the credit union and community bank for originating the loan? Is the community bank and credit union going to have to keep percentage of the loan, just make its income on that?
Yeah, we
Who
need to
gets
ask
to
your
hold the
question,
lien?
please.
All those questions.
Mm-hmm.
How do you prevent that? What are the safeguards against that kind of situation in this setup?
Yeah, I think the main one is that the state bank would partner only with community banks and credit unions, and that the state bank or local public banks would have a mission statement of what they are bound to invest in and use your money for. So as in anything that is in the political realm, the insurance that is going to work the way you expect it to work is for all of us to be very watchful of what they do. And there will be lots of private banks that will want to highlight any possible violation of the public trust. So I don't know, specifically, I can't be specific about that. But I do think, having the public purpose, which is defined publicly in conversations around the area, and then being able to watch what those banks actually do.
But if you're
Yeah, there's a
doing
lot
that,
of questions.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got a question from Richard on Zoom. What are the number of state banks? And if North Dakota is the only one, why is there only one state bank?
Oh, yes. Well, again, yes. There are now two state banks of sorts. The Bank of North Dakota, which has existed successfully for 100 years, returning financial benefits back to the state. And then the newly created, this was just a couple of years ago, Bank of American Samoa, which had, the only private bank that had serviced them, decided not to service them anymore, and they were left bankless. And so they created a public bank. I stated in my remarks about salaries that the board of directors would receive, and nowhere, anywhere remotely close to $35 million that Jamie Dimon receives just as a pay raise. Why? There were a number of other public banks that were created in the 30s, and exactly why they were not successful and the Public Bank of North Dakota was I don't really know. I do know that public banks everywhere were subject to too big to fail banks opposition and obstruction at every turn. And so I'm going to guess that most of them just were not able to successfully counter that opposition. But a lot of that is speculation on my part, and I haven't read a whole lot about that.
Go ahead, sir. We have a question from Friendly House.
I have two questions which ought to be able to be answered fairly briefly. One is, doesn't the Citizens United decision basically eliminate all limits on campaign finance, number one? And number two, how much capital would be required to set up a public bank in Oregon, and where would it come from?
Okay, on the second question, that is one of the topics that the State Public Banking Task Force will look at. Is how much capitalization, how much funds from the state of Oregon need to be appropriated to fund the establishment of the bank. So,
Okay, so we don't know at this point.
we don't know at this point. And that's the real value, or one of the real values of doing the task force and letting all these various people come in and have their shot at determining something like that. So I should not have started with the second question, because now I've forgotten your first
The
question.
first question was, doesn't the Citizens United decision equating money with speech preclude limits on campaign finance contributions?
Yeah, the answer to that is no. Limits on campaign contributions are still constitutional under the U.S. Constitution as well as the Oregon Constitution now, and the Citizens United decision said that you could not put limits on what became known as dark money. And so if they're not so-called independent expenditures, which are made independent of the candidate, then those limits are still constitutional. And so we are definitely moving forward in Oregon to finally establish some limits on campaign contributions and expenditures.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Anne has a question at Friendly House.
A quick one. I have no idea whether this is even something that.
Go ahead.
Okay. Are they FDIC insured? And what does FDIC do if not to insure? You know, I don't understand that.
Yeah.
Is it insured?
Well,
would they be insured?
yeah, it could be, but it doesn't have to be. And the reason it doesn't have to be is because public banks operate with deposits from governmental agencies and governmental funds. And those funds are deposited far in excess of what the FDIC insurance requires, which is $250,000. So I'm sorry. So if the public bank actually turned into a retail bank with branches and asked for us to make deposits into them, then yes, the FDIC insurance requirements would apply. Right. Okay. Great.
Our next question's from Sharon at Friendly House.
Okay, that's me. Anyway, my dad wrote a book about painless taxation, but mostly in it, he said that the St. John's Bridge is paid 3 times to the bank back east, who didn't put a stick of anything in it or labor, except how to put the money in their pocket.
Mhm.
By 3 times more than what the bridge cost to build it, in interest. And of course, he was for the state bank. So I was going to invite this guy who came to the city club that was in a wheelchair and greet him, but everybody was there.
Sharon,
And
you have
I
to ask your question.
Okay, I told him anyway. Anyway, he very quickly put in the Willamette Week how he was going to make a state bank. But what I heard at the City Club was he was making this is why I'm saying you get reaction. They said that he found a solution to a problem that wasn't there. In other words, we've got banks already.
Sharon, you need to ask your question.
And what I'm asking is that I am a Pacific Green Party. I would like the three parties or whatever agrees with you to unite into one so we could have more power. Is that possible?
Thank you.
I think that the Pacific Green Party and the Oregon Progressive Party are very closely aligned and work on projects together. But neither of us see value in having fewer political parties. The Oregon Progressive Party has in particular championed the limits on campaign contributions and so forth, as well as the state public bank. It is always, I think, always good to have allies, but not to remove voices from the discussion, which a merger of the Pacific Green Party and the Progressive Party would actually do. So I think that there's a disadvantage to a merger rather than an advantage.
Thank you.
Does that come close?
John, we have a question from Friendly House from Johnny.
Yes, the subject is Glass-Steagall, which I believe was recalled in 2000, which was Clinton's last year. The question is, was it politically? I want you to discuss the politics of why it was recalled, and was it recalled with a veto-proof majority? And if so, if it was not, why didn't Clinton veto it?
Well, I think the main characteristic of Bill Clinton was that he was a corporate Democrat, and that he thought that the more that Democrats were able to get money from corporate interests to run their campaigns, the better off that the Democrats would be. Unfortunately, that attitude, which had to do with both the Glass-Steagall and with the trade agreements, totally undermined the message that Democrats potentially have of providing to all of us. And so I think it was his willingness to do what corporate America wanted, as opposed to what we wanted, that really drove that, and why Clinton acted in the way that he did.
We have a question from Friendly House from Dakota.
Good morning, sir.
Morning.
I also just firstly wanted to say thank you for the work that you do in the Progressive Party already and have done. I have two questions, and I hope I can put them succinctly, but the first being whether or not a wide instituting of things such as public banks, what do you think that would do, if it would have any sort of negative effect possibly on the American private sector, especially if other countries don't adopt that? What sort of effect that would have? That's question number one. Question number two would be, as far as convincing other people to join SHIP, what would you say to someone you're trying to convince that might not be as enthusiastic about joining a public bank because of the differences that public institutions can differ in private institutions? So example, like you have NASA and you have SpaceX and Tesla, and sometimes one can be more, without necessarily breaking the rules, you can have, it's a lot more strict. So basically, what would you do to convince people who might not have as much faith in public institutions as opposed to things like private banks because of the different, steps that they can take?
Okay, so again, starting with the second question first, and probably forgetting your first question, so don't go away. I think that public banks' emphasis on partnering with local institutions, credit unions, and community banks is the strongest argument we can make for the value of a public bank. Keeping local resources local instead of shipping them off to Wall Street. There's a lot of literature about the benefits of the State Bank of North Dakota in terms of the banking community in North Dakota. There are more I may not get the wording exactly correct. There are more financial institutions in North Dakota, community banks and credit unions, per capita than anywhere else in the nation. So a public bank should not be seen as a competitor for local financial institutions. They are regarded, certainly and proven out in the state of North Dakota, as being partners and accelerating local investment. Does that kind of come close?
Yep, local private investment as well. Is it, or is it local
Oh.
public? Because the concern being is that if you, I wouldn't want America to be at any sort of disadvantage as far as, and I believe me, I'm not going to tell you that corporations are people. But the private sector does have a certain role. And so my concern is that if public banks, and this might be a thing with convincing people to, if public banks become too centralized and too government controlled, assuming everybody jumps ship, that may limit what we can do within the private sector internationally. It's at least if other countries don't do the same thing.
Yeah.
But I really don't see that as being a problem because the private banks have such a huge majority of the investment climate now that having to compete with a public bank should not be a problem for them. I mean, it's just such an outweighed. Now you speculate that we might, and I hope that we do, create an actual network, a national network of state and local public banks. And they would be competing with the too big to fail banks in North Dakota. But locally, we have resources to make these kind of investments and being sure that they actually benefit the local economy, not Wall Street. And I understand, I think I understand your fear about the private investments going away. But it's kind of like the corporate activities tax in Oregon, which some people speculated that with a corporate activities tax, which taxed the revenue of corporations in doing sales in the state of Oregon, that it would drive these retailers out of the state. But that doesn't happen because this is an important market for retailers. And they only make money if they stay here. So they're not going to go away. They may have to pay some more tax, but they're not going to go away because of it. And they do pricing based on national models, not on local models. It's too much busy work for them to look at the local market and see what can be a justifiable price to charge retail customers. So they stay. I don't see that having a public bank to compete with private investors will be a problem. It's speculation on my part. Thank you. And I'm sorry, I missed your first question though.
We're not gonna,
Oh,
sorry,
yes.
Dakota, we're not gonna get there.
Okay, thank you.
One very quick last question from Moringa. What is the annual return from a North Dakota public bank? What is the annual return from the North Dakota Public Bank? Is that a question you can answer?
That is a question that I just read the answer to last night. Do I remember it?
No, that's okay.
No.
But it sounds like it is, it sounds like it could, yeah.
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 But I do know general impression was that the rate of return on the investments of the Public Bank of North Dakota is higher than the rate of return for the private too big to fail banks.
Okay.
No, I had another question. Basically, if my understanding is that this is the public bank will not be the kind of bank where an individual like myself would get a checking account or a savings account. That's not what it's for. It's
Yes,
there
that's
for
correct.
making investments in infrastructure at a local level.
Mhm.
But you had mentioned that the North Dakota Bank also does student loans.
Mhm.
And I wonder, how does a student at a university get in touch with the state bank? Or again, they have to go through the intermediary of a local credit union or a community bank in order to get funds from the state bank?
Go ahead and answer
So,
that question.
student loans were not an original investment activity on the part of the Bank of North Dakota. It was added after discussions in the North Dakota legislature, asking the bank if they could do this to provide a way for students to have much lower cost loans than they were getting from the other banks or wherever they get loans from. And so they created a special relationship for the Bank of North Dakota to create these loans for students. And students do not go directly to the Bank of North Dakota and say, give me a loan. They go through an intermediary. And I'm not entirely sure if those loans are generated from the credit unions and community banks and shared, or just what the relationship is.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
David, I'm afraid we're out of time, but thank you.